talking about books, and I'm really excited to be hosting this panel with these awesome authors who know a lot about fantasy. I'm just going to give a quick introduction for each of them, and then I'll start some general questions, and then later on open it up for everybody else to ask questions. Starting on the end over there, we have C. Robert Cargill, who wrote as a film critic for over 10 years at Ain't It Cool News and is the writer of the horror film Sinister. It seems what he has seen has oozed into his writing. The imagery invoked in his acclaimed debut Dreams and Shadows series has been linked to the visual inventiveness of Guillermo del Toro. His follow-up Queen of Darkness is out in 2014, continues the story of fairies, magics, and monsters. Next to him is that Gitty? Yeah. Gitty Daneshvari admittedly talks too much. She turned to writing as an outlet for her thoughts. Her thoughts have brought the middle grade series School of Fear, where kids were sent away to be taught how to overcome their fears, and Monster High, where students brush up on their mad science and physical dedication. Next to her is Soman Chainani, a Harvard-educated fairy tale expert, is the New York Times bestselling author of The School of Good and Evil and the middle grade novel that turns all preconceived notions of Disney princesses and Grimes fairy tales upside down. Soman is also the acclaimed screenwriter and is currently working on a script for the adaptation of his book with Mila Scott for Universal Studios, which is slated for 2015. Soman lives in New York City. Next to him is Bennett Madison. He's an author and editor whose latest novel, September Girls, dives into the magical waters of mermaids through the eyes of teenagers through a boy who's just trying to figure out life. He hails from Maryland, and his previous occupations include phone psychic, clothes folder, and writer of not very good cartoons. Next is Emily Croy Barker, whose debut novel has been labeled as If Hermione Granger Had Been an American Who Never Received the Invitation to Hogwarts by People magazine. When she's not dreaming of magical ultimate worlds, she's the executive editor at American Woman magazine. And finally, Catherynne M. Valente is a New York Times bestselling author of fantasy and science fiction novels, her short stories and poetry. From her home on a small island off the coast of Maine, she has dreamed up many worlds, including the popular Fairyland series about a young girl who finds adventure knocking on her kitchen window. That's okay. I got it out, everybody. I got it out.
Thank you. We'll see you next year.
So I'll start with a few questions. Start with you at the very end, Robert. Can you tell us about your book, starting with the classic Once Upon a Time intro?
Well, once upon a time, there was a man and woman who loved each other very much, and they had a child, and then an evil thing crawled into the window and stole that child, and it ends very badly for the man and woman. And then once upon a time, there was another boy who found a genie, and the genie gave him one wish, and once he realized that genies existed, he asked what else exists, you know, are there angels, are there fairies? He's like, well, yeah, he's like, well, that's my wish, I wish you would take me around and show them. And it's all about how bad a decision that really is. And, so it's about these two boys and how their lives become intertwined and how it ultimately screws them up as adults and comes to a head and brings it kind of to a epic, tragic conclusion.
Go down the line.
Okay. Once upon a time, there were the four most neurotic kids in the world who were sent to special school to overcome their fears, run by a deranged beauty queen and her manservant Cheney. And then once upon a time, there was a high school filled with the children of monsters, and where they have to come together to battle the forces of evil, trying to take over the school.
Once upon a time, there was a girl who waited her entire life to be kidnapped. Her name is Sophie, and all she wanted in the entire world is to be kidnapped to this school for good and evil, where she's going to be a princess and meet the hottest prince in the entire world and just get away from real life. And so she decides to make friends with the girl that she knows is going to be kidnapped to the school for evil, who is this very witchy girl named Agatha, who spits at boys and has a one-eyed cat and lives in a graveyard and just, you know, is sort of the prototypical witch. And in fact, they do actually get kidnapped to this legendary school. for Good and Evil that trains kids to be fairy tale heroes and villains, and you sort of graduate into your own fairy tale. Only as they're taken over the school by these, birds to be dropped in their schools. Sophie, our princess to be, is dropped in the school for evil with future murderers and monsters. And then you've got Agatha, the witch, dropped with the hottest princes and princesses in the school for good. And the question is, why?
Once upon a time, there were sisters who were cursed to leave their homes and were exiled to live at the beach and work as waitresses and housekeepers and checkout girls. And once upon the same time, there was a boy who really wanted to meet some girls and had the bad, or perhaps good, fortune, depending on how you looked at it, to meet these ones. And hilarity ensued. And tragedy.
Once upon a time, there was a very unhappy graduate student named Nora. Her thesis was stalled. Her boyfriend was about to marry someone else. She went to a fabulous party and her life changed. She made some glamorous new friends. She found herself more beautiful and popular than she'd ever been before in her life. She met a handsome man, a charming man, fell in love with him, and got married. It all seemed too good to be true. And in fact, it was too good to be true. It was actually an enchantment in which she had to escape with the help of the magician Arundel, and which she did with some reluctance. Nora found herself in a much more hostile and harsher world than she'd ever imagined, and realized that if she was going to survive, she would have to learn to use magic herself. But first she had to convince Arundel to teach her.
Once upon a time, there was a girl who loved deeply but had huge problems with Narnia, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, and the Wizard of Oz. So she made a girl who lived in Omaha to carry a big stick and poke at the sides of the assumptions of those books. The girl was named September. On her journey, she met A through L, who is half wyvern and half library, Saturday, who is a kind of oceanic genie, and the Marquess, who is a terrible, terrible young girl with a very fun hat who rules over Fairyland. At the moment, she's battling time-traveling yetis on the moon, and still carrying her big stick.
So clearly all of your books involve different types of creatures that are kind of found within fantasy books, mermaids, dragons, fairies, all that kind of stuff. Which creature would you guys not want to meet in a dark alley?
And why? I think a dragon would be pretty, they can destroy you with one breath, basically. Whereas a fairy, you might have some fun with them before it was over.
It's true. Steal some dust.
I'd say a protagonist. They're causing the most trouble of anybody in any given book.
I've met several fairies in dark alleys, more than I should probably say. And it went fine. I like mermaids. I think mermaids can be a little scary, but they're fun if you talk to them the right way. So I guess I'll say dragon by default. Although dragons, don't they usually have gold with them? So that would be good too. I think I would like to meet all of them. I like dark alleys.
I've got this creature in the second book that I'm working on now called an Inger troll, which is this sort of saggy female troll that has a particular liking for handsome boys. And whenever these boys cross with girls over a bridge, if a happy couple crosses, it'll eject the girl off the bridge. So that's sort of my favorite one.
I think actually I would be open to meeting any of them. I feel like I could use a bit more excitement in my life, so I'm open.
There's this fairy tale that messes with me. I believe it's a German tale, and it's about the Elf King's daughter. And she's a girl that you meet while you're traveling down the road. And she's this absolutely beautiful girl, and she asks you to dance with her. She just wants you to dance with her. And you have two choices. You can either dance with her, at which point you'll never be able to stop dancing, and you'll dance until you die, or she'll be so angry she will curse you, and your body will start rotting, and you'll have a horrible, horrible death. So it really is, choosing. You get no choice. It's one of those horrible fairy tales that just kind of mess with me, that there's no way, just if you happen upon her, you choose your death. And that's the one I would want.
What's the name of that fairy tale? Do you know?
I think it's called The Elf King's Daughter. I think that's what it's called.
Okay, so a lot of your books span age ranges. What do you guys think about the genre of fantasy specifically seems to transcend age, and at every point in life you kind of want to dabble in these stories?
You guys want to give a shot at that?
Well, from a very young age, we start creating our own fairy tales to just try to explain the world around us. I mean, probably everyone in this room, at some point when they were 4 or 5 years old, watched the TV and believed that there were little people in there acting those things out for you. And eventually you come to find out that it's not really that way. And you reach that age where you start understanding that the world isn't made up of all these little magical fairy people and all this magical wonder that holds it together. And then you kind of start pining for that again. And you kind of want to get in touch with that way you felt when you imagined the little people in the television. And I think it kind of stems from that childlike wonder of how the world works and kind of wishing that it really did work that way. And that's something you never let go of.
So here's the thing about fairy tales. They're the best ended stories of all time. They're thousands of years old. They've been transferred from culture to culture, told from person to person, and everything boring and not the most vivid images you can possibly think of has been cut out so that kids would still pay attention, and adults would still pay attention. So you're left with these boiled down, espresso-like stories that go straight to the back of your reptile brain, and they are expressions of sort of primeval human logic. And if you think we're not primeval, I got news for you. I love fairy tales, and I keep telling them because they tell the truth about life on planet Earth. I grew up with a wicked stepmother, so I actually just took them as documentaries. Like, accurate. People are looking to do horrible things to children. Awesome. This reflects my experience. But the most important thing that fairy tales teach us to do, and they do it in really the shortest space possible, is teach us how to survive. Almost all fairy tales are about terrible things happening to children. And usually, though the older versions were much more violent and sexy and all that, we've all been through that lecture, I'm sure, before, and know that the older ones are better. But even in the older ones, almost always, one child survives. And that is what I learned from fairy tales. That is what, over and over again, I hear kids learning from fairy tales, even if they can't quite put it into words, that they're learning that they can live through anything. Even what happens to Snow White, even what happens to Rapunzel, even the worst things that can possibly happen to a person.
It's funny, because I was just thinking about, what fantasy allows you to do is take fairy tales, which are these very sort of short-form stories, and novelize them. So you actually get to bring angst and sort of teenage emotions to these very sort of primal situations. Like, instead of being like, oh, girl had a wicked stepmother, you can actually explore the dimensions of the relationship between them. And, as we're working on the movie, the funny thing is, we're sort of looking at old Disney movies and how you can actually explode all those conventions just by going into the reality of the situation. It's like, I sort of think about the third Harry Potter movie and the way that movie sort of stood out to me, because Alfonso Cuarón sort of got in there and actually explored the angst of those characters in very sort of fantastical, crazy situations. And I think what I'm always aspiring to in the School for Good and Evil is to try to give them kind of modern kid emotions, in the sort of most archetypal situations at every point. And as the series deepens, sort of get into the sort of darkness of growing up as a teenager in a fairy tale world.
And I think also, like, sort of going back to what Catherynne was saying, fairy tales, because of the way they've been passed down and because of the way they've been told, they've always had to be very compact in their structure and pack a lot of punch into like a small piece that can be repeated over and over again. And not only that, but they had to be both interesting to the teller and to the person who's being told the story, which a lot of times is an adult and a child. And I think because of that, you find that fairy tales have all these different layers because in order to appeal to these different sort of separate audiences and in order to be very short, they have to sort of compress everything into a tiny little ball. And so every time you hear a fairy tale, or read it again, I feel like you can peel away a little bit more of it and find sort of another piece of the story that you never noticed before, and have a different perspective on it as well the older you get, which may or may not be more interesting than the perspective you had when you read it the first time.
I agree. I think fairy tales give you a kind of a safe space to write about some very dark themes. Death, aging, loss. As a writer, I find that kind of exciting. I think a lot of fantasy for children is, a lot of those are coming of age stories, which is terrific. One thing I tried to do in my book is to find, sort of move beyond that a little bit. My protagonist, Nora, is still finding herself, so it's in a way it's a coming of age story. But the nice, sort of enjoyable thing about writing fantasy for adults is that you can take it in more directions and explore kind of more adult concerns and which are scary in their own way.
So you guys have all encountered fairy tales and fantasy books at different ages in your lives. Do you remember the one story that made you be like, yes, I need to start writing in this genre, this has got me and I need to explore this?
I mean, look at me, Snow White. As far as fairy tales go, that was it for me. My mother certainly didn't die, but she was absent for most of my childhood. So I had this distant mother who looked just like me, and my stepmother who is blonde and blue-eyed and had a bunch of blonde and blue-eyed children. And it was very accurate to my experience. So very early on, I was like, okay, well, I'm Snow White, and my friends who have equally horrible childhood experiences are these other ones, and are Cinderella and Rapunzel and all of that. So that was a huge fairy tale for me, but it was the Never-Ending Story, the novel, actually, that really made me want to start making stories like that on my own. I don't know how many people have read the novel as opposed to seeing the movie. The movie's great, but okay, you guys have some homework. Because seriously, the movie ends halfway through the book, and the book is extraordinary and amazing. It has different colored text. It has beautiful, incredible inhabited capitals at the beginning of every chapter, and it's an extraordinarily emotionally complex book. The author is a certified genius. He's just amazing. And it was actually the first book, not for kids, that I read. I read it when I was 5, and my parents didn't believe that I read it, so I had to give a book report in the middle of the kitchen during a dinner party because they said I was lying. So I had to tell everybody what the book
was. That The Wicked Stepmother?
Of course it was. Are you kidding? Yeah, so The Never-Ending Story became this sort of talismanic book for me. And I mean, even just the idea of a story that never ended sank into my head before I had any kind of critical thinking to deal with it, and never left.
When I was 8 years old, I had a huge crush on Drew Barrymore. And we're the exact same age. And I had seen a couple of her movies and a couple of the things she did on TV, and she had this new movie coming out, and I could not wait to see it. I've got to see this movie, I've got to see this movie. And I told my parents, I have to see this new movie, and they're like, we're not taking you to a Stephen King movie. And it was Firestarter, and so my aunt, who was just 5 years older than me, she was like, well, for Christmas I'll just buy him the book, and it's got a picture of Drew Barrymore on the cover, and he'll be happy, and he's not going to read that book. He's 8 years old. It looks like that thick. And my parents were like, you're not giving our kid a Stephen King novel. I was like, he'll never read it. Well, of course I sat down and I read it cover to cover. Then I read it cover to cover again. About the third time I was reading it, I was like, wow, this Stephen King guy, he gets paid to do this. I want to do this too. And I've always thought of Firestarter as more of a fairy tale than it is any of, it's certainly detached from his horror stuff. It's, the story of this little girl that's gifted with this really terrible power that she has to always keep in check. And it's about how the outside world keeps forcing her to have to use it to try to defend herself and her father. And ultimately, by the end, when her father dies, she loses it and just completely becomes the monster. And I've always, that story's always touched me, and that's something that has worked its way into the DNA of almost everything that I've written. And that book really kind of stuck with me, and I revisit it every few years and still marvel at just how wonderful a book it is.
My books are, I'm probably a bit younger than everyone else on the panel, middle grade, and I have to say that I wasn't as, I probably shouldn't say this on this panel, but I wasn't actually as inspired as everyone else was by fairy tales. They gave me a lot of anxiety as a child, so my parents stopped reading them to me, because I had plenty of anxiety as it was, which is why I wrote School of Fear, because I used to have all those fears. Maybe I still do. But actually, who inspired me the most was Roald Dahl, because his books they were absurdist, they were dark, they were funny, they were like nothing I had ever read before, but they didn't leave me with this sort of like sense of like doom that I felt from fairy tales. I'm sorry, I can't just say that. So I feel like BFG, The Twits, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, you know, James the Giant Peach, like I sort of liked the way he dealt with death, like when the peach just rolls over the nasty aunts. And so that was like a form of death that was acceptable to me, as opposed to the fairy tale deaths that really, I needed like child Xanax, so, which they didn't give me.
You know, the thing that appealed to me most as a kid is I used to be obsessed with female villains. I just felt like wicked women were just sort of what I look forward to in movies. And I think there's, what, 56 Disney animated movies, and only 7 feature female villains. But if you think of those 7, they're the ones that everybody like remembers the most. Those are the most classic ones, like Snow White, Cinderella, Little Mermaid, Rescue, Sword in the Stone. I haven't thought about this, clearly. Like, I'm all memorized because I've seen them a million times. Sleeping Beauty, which is my favorite. And so, you know, I think the reason I'm so attracted to female villains, and the series is so much about how a woman ultimately becomes wicked, or even how a teenage girl becomes wicked, is because they don't have the conveniences that a male villain usually has, which is a male villain usually has brute strength, or these sort of like, you know, gigantic henchmen, or an army, or something that naturally comes with them, or weapons, most of all. And a female villain has to rely on seduction and sort of manipulation, and sort of these very complex motivations and skills that I think a man usually doesn't have as a villain. And so, you know, I was inspired most of all by stories, you know, Roald Dahl stories that, you know, Matilda, for instance, that had a female villain, and Disney movies that had female villains.
Before I answer, I think it's bizarre that Roald Dahl books didn't make you anxious.
They didn't. I felt like really at home in those worlds. I know, but I had a lot of anxiety and like intense nights crying after fairy tales. I don't know why. My grandmother gave me a book, and my mother would read it to me, and I would cry, and my sister would be like, "Oh God, my sister's so annoying." But it was something weird, just inspired that.
I was so terrified by the witches that I got halfway through the book, and I thought the only way I can actually continue this book is if I skip all the way to the end and then read it page by page in reverse. To like completely remove all suspense. And it worked, but I mean, those books are, I mean, I have a lot of anxiety too, so I can relate, but actually I think the fairy tale that sort of was most central in my, I guess, development as a writer, I don't know if everyone would even consider it a fairy tale, but I do. And I also, I came to it a little bit, a little later, I think, than everyone else. Although I was already a big reader, but I didn't quite know what I wanted to write, or even that I wanted to be a writer. And then I read Weetsy by Francesca Leablock. Do you guys know this book? That's a fairy tale, right? I mean, she finds a genie and everything's perfect, and then it's sort of not. And, you know, that book completely sort of shattered all of my ideas about what a story could be, even though it's an incredibly simple story. It sort of, like, condensed everything into, like, just the basics. Sort of, maybe not. But that definitely was the book that made me sort of realize, that was the story that made me realize that you can tell a story in a different way, you can do something different, and that stories that seem like they're for children are not necessarily for children. Stories that seem like they're for adults are not necessarily for adults. And also, as I've reread it, as I've gotten older, I still adore it. But I've sort of discovered that I understand it less and less the older I get. And I think that's what makes it, to me, a perfect book for teenagers. And I always say, like, I hope that the older you get, the less you understand my books as well. And then, just to answer in a more easy way, I guess, I read every single one of the Oz books when I was 6 years old, and there's like hundreds of, well, there's like 50 of them or something, so many more than I think a lot of people realize. And I love them, so that also.
I read the Oz books too, and Narnia, and pretty much all of fantasy I could get my hands on, which sort of backfired when I came across a copy of Stricklepater. I don't know if you've ever come across it. It's like a 19th century children's book about the terrible things that happen to little boys who don't cut their fingernails, for example, or who refuse to eat soup, or suck their thumbs. I mean, a tailor comes and cuts off your thumbs. The illustration is still, vivid in my memory, although I haven't seen it for 20 years. But I love the Oz books too. Those were kind of what I really devoured. One thing that always bothered me about books about magic when I was a kid is that it ends. You lose the magic token, or it loses its powers, or you have to leave Narnia or Oz, and sometimes Aslan tells you can't go back. I thought that was terribly, terribly unfair. And I think one thing that kind of inspired me to write fantasy was just the desire to get back to Oz or to Narnia.
Just to kind of play off of the vividness of all the books that you guys are talking about, and Robert might come back at me on this question, but we'll see. For me, I feel like there are many more excellent fantasy books than there are good fantasy films. So I just want to know what you guys think makes fantasy thrive so well in pages.
Well, since you called me out, I'll jump in on that. No, you're absolutely
I'm
correct.
sure you watch way more fantasy.
Hollywood has never, I say never, but not until recently taken fantasy seriously, and even then, they only take things seriously that have established gargantuan fan bases. One of my favorite stories of bad Hollywood goes back to 1982, this great film that I love, but a lot of people love to put on bad lists, which is called Crawl. Which is this great adventure story of this guy, she's a princess fighting a demon. It's kind of a dirty dozen with a bunch of magical people and a wizard who's really a bumbling fool, but ends up having this magical sacrifice. It's just a really cool movie, and it's got this beautiful princess in it who all of her lines are terrible, and the issue is that they dubbed her, and the reason the studio dubbed her is they said, and I swear to God this is true, American audiences won't buy a British person in a fantasy film. And so as a result, you have this amazing actress giving this terrible performance because they've had some American actors come in and dub all of her lines. And it's a goofy movie, but Hollywood has always made mistakes like that. They've always just done bucket-headed things or not gotten things right or rushed things. We just saw that happen this year with Mortal Instruments, where that script actually came to me and Scott last year, and they wanted us to do it, and I looked at it, looked at the timetable they wanted, they're like, we want this out for next summer. I'm like, the script you have right now needs so much work to adapt the book and get it right, and that, you're not gonna, it's not gonna be doable, and I just called Scott and said, no, we can't do this, and I assumed that they would, stumble and it wouldn't happen and be pushed back, but no, sure enough, within 10 months of me getting that script, they had a film in theaters, and it was just like, they just never took it. The marketing team took it seriously. They sent a whole bunch of my critic friends, and even me, I'm still on some of the lists, all the books, so I got a nice hardcover set of the books, but I don't think the screenwriter read the book, but it really is, it's this thing that, there's so much great support in the publishing industry for good fantasy, and so it's out there. But Hollywood, it just the executives tend not to get it, and there's some of them are starting to. You've got execs starting to come up that grew up with the Harry Potter books and then were inspired to read all the other stuff, as so many kids have been. I have a soundtrack now. It's amazing.
It sounds like a trailer now.
Yes, I normally go, I think I have more of a 70s funk vibe. So now I think we're going to start seeing that in the next 10 to 15 years as the Harry Potter kids start making movies and take fantasy seriously. But just so far, there's only a handful where you've really gotten people like Alfonso Cuarón who came in and said, no, don't do this like a big budget Chris Columbus movie. This is a fairy tale, which is why that third film stands as the best, the worst adaptation, but the best Harry Potter.
Well, okay, here's the thing though. So I think that what we're talking about here is a pretty specific kind of fantasy, because the kind of fantasy that's being taken seriously is epic fantasy, is Game of Thrones kind of fantasy. But the fact is that the best fantasy movies, for my money, are movies like Labyrinth, And to say that, I mean, yes, Hollywood doesn't get anything. Not like Sturgeon's law applies. 90% of everything's crap. And I think that you'll be hard pressed to find more than a handful of really quality science fiction films as well, or you know, realist films. Like, it is difficult to make a good movie, full stop. But there have been a fairly large amount of fantasy movies that are very good. They just weren't made this decade. And I think that part of the issue with that is that only certain kinds of fantasy are the ones that are considered good enough, adult enough to be taken seriously. So we have to put a lot of nudity and violence in it, or it's not a real story. Whereas we're up here talking about fairy tales, which are considered in our culture for children anyway, and then therefore get Disneyfied. But we have Miyazaki, who makes amazing fantasy films, and we have actually quite a few examples of this stuff being done incredibly well. But it's not in the sort of Hollywood mill where huge amounts of money are assumed to be made off of it because of the giant fandoms. But when you look at something like Labyrinth, I think it's clear that a group of dedicated people can make something that, good lord, that movie's 30 years old. I mean, we all, who hasn't seen Labyrinth? Yeah. It is Henson.
To make a fair point about it, though, you know, Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal were both Henson, and he got a lot of pushback from the studios on both those films. They were not easy for him to make, or to convince anyone to let him make, and they're both amazing.
Is there any good movie that didn't get pushback from the studios? I feel like the studios like, it's good.
Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings actually was just the opposite. The true story about why Lord of the Rings is so awesome is it was the studio head who was what? Yes, he was on his way out at New Line, and you probably know.
I know Mark Bordesky is a friend of mine, and he was on the way out, but later he had a moment of, because he was the comedy with Peter Jackson.
Oh no, well you may know parts of the story as well, but yeah. So essentially, what happened was he green-lighted a nearly unlimited budget for the films, and so Peter Jackson literally had enough money that when something wasn't working, he was able to just say, okay, throw out that 3 months of work and start again, we're going to do this in this scene. And he was able to put that together and there's never going to be a film that will have that unlimited budget again, and there never was before. It was literally, they had a rubber stamp to do whatever they wanted, and the New Line was 100% behind them, and he turned those out. But that is the one example.
But I mean, Peter Jackson, like Henson, you're talking about a concerted group of people with a singular vision who are incredibly dedicated, and I think it's those cadres that make the kind of movies that we all want to see. I find it really interesting, Legend. So I love Legend. I refuse to apologize for that. But I will not. But watching the featurettes and the people who made the movie talking about what a failure they think the movie is. I mean, from actors to Ridley Scott to everything, talking about how the studio ruined it and the original script was so much better. And there's absolutely no positive thing that they say on the special edition DVD of this movie about the movie they make. And I think it's interesting that each and every one of them fails to understand how beloved that movie is and why people like it. And I think that disconnect between understanding how to make a film that gets into theaters and how to make a film that nobody forgets is a void that is difficult to cross for everyone.
But I think that one of the things that comes into play now, because I'm doing this movie for Universal now, which is it's massively budgeted, and it's Joe Roth producing it, who did Alice in Wonderland and is doing Maleficent next summer, did Snow White and the Huntsman. And I think the difference now is that the budgets are huge in order to get one of these things out, meaning that they have to appeal to the biggest possible audience just from an economic point of view. And so, you know, the challenge I'm always facing, because I'm sure, you know, if anybody's read the book or will read the book, there's a lot of controversial stuff in this that, you know, especially the ending, that if you play straight up for the movie, you're gonna have some trouble with certain parts of audiences. And I think one of the things that you have to do is, you know, if you're gonna make a movie out of your property, you have to have it contracted before you start. It has to follow the story, and it can't mess up the story. And I think that's one of the things that you can use as an author when your book gets turned into a movie, to make sure that at the very least it's gonna be faithful to the story. And, you know, the rest of it is going to get massaged by the studios, because even more now, the $150 million, $200 million budgets, they're not going to give a filmmaker complete control unless you have a complete outlier or fluke, like Yoda's situation.
sorry, but I just want to say that is a great position to be in, where you're in a situation where you control, your book has been that successful. But most authors, myself included, when someone comes to you and is offering an option fee, you're not in a position to say to the studio, okay, but I want complete control. So basically you're putting an end ultimately to it, and you can't do that. I think the biggest issue with Hollywood right now is that the marketing budgets are so large for these films that, like, there's only tentpole films. There's no world where we can make these fantasy films on a smaller scale that could go the way of, you know, direct to Apple, and you could download it, where you could have a smaller audience and you could have a much smaller marketing campaign. I think that right now you're in a position where only, you know, books that are going to be huge New York Times bestsellers, or these, you know, classics like Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are going to get traction at a studio, because they're just making fewer and fewer films. And I mean, I feel like that's why everyone's always like, television is where it's at. And I do think because there's a lot more options, and financially you don't have to put quite as much in to begin with.
To kind of put a pin in it, the best script in Hollywood right now that's been floating around for years that is unmade, if you ask, you know, people around town, what's the best script that nobody's made yet? It's called A Killing on Carnival Row. And what it is it is an original urban fantasy movie that's kind of set in the Victorian era, but fairies are part of the culture, and they're kind of a put-upon class. And it's a very rated R, gritty detective movie about a detective who's in love with a fairy prostitute, and fairy prostitutes start getting killed and having their wings ripped off, and all of these. You know, as a script, it's just fantastic. Guillermo del Toro was attached to it at one point, and even he couldn't get it on the ground because no studio knows how to take an $80–100 million rated R fantasy film and market that, because they just don't know how to take it to audiences. It's the type of thing that if I handed the script to this audience in here, you guys would love it and be like, yes, I see this. Why isn't this a movie yet? But Hollywood just can't figure out how to make it work.
That's why he lost that other movie too, the Madness or whatever.
Well, he wanted to make a $150 million horror movie based on H.P. Lovecraft, and he actually wanted to shoot it in Antarctica. That's why. I love Guillermo. I love him. But it's like, dude, shoot plates, shoot on green screen. No, the light. They don't understand the light. It's different than everything. It's like you can capture the light with film.
So I think the moral of the story is that we keep the books and the world in our mind for the time being until Hollywood can get.
If I could say one more thing, I mean, I think that coming back to the original question, part of the stumbling block is simply special effects. That you can do an independent movie at, you know, your house, and it cannot really have the level of special effects why we need that budget. And it's my hope that as digital effects and all of that, much like digital film becomes more and more accessible, that we'll get the fantasy version of Primer. That we'll get independent films that can do what we want to see on screen without the kind of interference and the pressure of the kind of budgets you guys are talking about.
To steer it back a little bit, I'm going to ask one final question and then turn it to you guys for some questions. But I just wanted to know if you guys think that there are any rules to writing fantasy. If yes, if no. If yes, what are they? If no, why?
The answer is always magic. I think the rule to fantasy is never to strip the magic away, to always leave the magic. I think there's, when you talk to people, one of my favorite ways to figure out if someone's an optimist or a pessimist is to ask them what they think the ending of Pan's Labyrinth is. And it's like, if you think she goes off to be the fairy princess and that she succeeded in the quest, you're an optimist. If you think she's a little girl in the 1930s Spain who died horribly, then you're a pessimist. And I think that the people, everybody who loves that movie, depending on the ending, despite the ending, I think there's a certain magic that's lost into that darker ending of Guillermo's film, in which the idea of that none of this magic existed and it was just all in her head, that's a film that I don't want to watch. I only, whenever I watch that film, I look at it as a fantasy film, and I think that writing fantasy, that's the one rule, is always keep the magic.
It's a good rule.
I think for me, it's I have this on my board on my desk. It says, it's not fantasy to them, meaning like, to your characters, it's not fantasy, it's real. So I think with fantasy, you actually have to be more grounded in your characters than any other genre, because it's real to them. What they're experiencing is, sensually, in terms of every sense they're having of the world is real and it feels normal to them. So it's all about grounding them.
I think I have two rules. One is that whatever the magic is, whatever the world is, it has to be consistent. You can't change how the magic works in the middle of the game. You have to set up a few, figure out at the very beginning how this is going to play out, and then kind of stick to that framework. And the other rule I think is your character, which sort of is in line with this, is that you need real characters in an unreal setting. Your characters have to be real people. They have to have emotions. They have to be able to be hurt. They have to be able to love. And if you've got that going on in the most outlandish, wild, crazy setting, you still have something that will feel very real to your readers.
I know there are rules. People always tell me there are rules. I'm like really horrible at following rules. And I think that's why a lot of people, including myself actually, are not quite sure whether to describe my book as fantasy at all, which is what I love about it. It's like a mermaid. It's sort of like slippery and slips between this sort of categories, and that's not a rule. That's just what I like to do with my writing. I like things that sort of transform back and forth as you watch them, and that are hard to pin down. Someday I will get a list of rules and make sure I commit them to memory and really figure it out and get with the program. My editor would probably like that. But in the meantime, I'm just gonna be a flake about it.
I think I set up different rules for every book, and the fun of writing a book is setting up rules and then breaking them one by one. So, I think everything that's been said about realness, it's interesting to hear a lot of fantasy writers talk about realness, but it's very true. And as far as emotional reality and character reality, I think that you have to treat your characters in a Kantian fashion. People are not means to an end, they are ends in themselves. I think about, sort of a touchstone for me in thinking about that is Hansel and Gretel, thinking about what they go through. Yeah, you're never okay again. There is no chance that Hansel and Gretel go on to live a normal German life and have children and everything's fine and they get together for Christmas. No. There's always consequences. There's consequences for every action, and for the most part, especially when magic's involved, you don't get to go on as a character as though the story never happened. There is no reset at the end, as there is in the end of television episodes sometimes, and you have to be true to the way that life actually rolls out, or there's no point in telling a fairy tale.
Hey audience, does anybody have a question? Stand up. Do you guys all hear that?
Yeah.
Any mythical creature you think is overdone in fantasy novels?
All of them.
Everything can be interesting. I mean, I think that doing the same thing over and over again is not interesting, but I think that, I was so bored of vampires until Buffy came along, and Buffy was totally different. So, you never know what is gonna sort of change the rules.
I'll jump in. Unicorns. I think we got the single greatest unicorn story we're ever going to get with The Last Unicorn. And anytime a unicorn shows up, it almost feels like someone didn't do their homework. It's like, oh, this is one of the fantasy creatures you remember, because everybody talks about unicorns, whereas there's so much great that gets neglected. There's just I have an entire shelf at home of nothing but research encyclopedias on the history of folklore and fantasy and fairy tales, and there's just so many great neglected monsters and creatures lurking in there. Why would you go with unicorns?
It just makes me want to write a unicorn story.
Seriously, the reason you do unicorns is so you can do something that is totally off the map. That to me that seems like a major fun challenge. And unicorns are cool.
Unicorns.
No, they're so cool.
This was an opinion.
They're pretty.
Does it help if I tell you that the bonus
There's different kinds. Yes, exactly.
He plays it in the lap of a maiden.
Played the magical penis horse. What an awesome fantasy creature.
dragons too, which is the easiest answer. But the fact is that any creature can be done in a new way, can be done interestingly. Like the most popular character that everyone loves, and people come up with little crocheted versions of him, is the wyvern from Fairyland. All right, a wyvern's a dragon. Like I can wave my hands and say it's not a dragon, but 2 legs, 4 legs, like, it's still a dragon. But you can always find a way to make it different, to make it new. And every time I hear someone say, oh, there's no way of doing X ever again, all I want to do is go prove them wrong because I'm incredibly contrary. But yeah, I mean, I think that probably all mythological creatures have at some point been overdone. Fairies, oh my God, like seriously. Whoever thought you could do anything new with fairies, and yet people do all the time. I just think that everything's already been told, but you haven't told everything. So it's the author, it's their unique perspective on the world, it's the metaphors they draw, it's the way that they make those creatures interact with others that makes it new and interesting.
The unicorn cameo in Cabin in the Woods was awesome. Steve.
Alright, this one's a little hard. This one's a little like the last one. What do you guys feel makes a good magic system? It's really hard to write magic right and make it feel magical. Not to name names, but I felt like in Aragon a little bit, it felt a little like science. You're pushing a button, you spend a little money, and you get your magic. So what makes it feel like magic to you, and what makes your magic feel magical?
I'll start with this one. I mean, it's such a great question because I'll tell you, for anybody doing a fantasy book, we spend weeks walking around New York, or at least I do, we'll walk around New York City, like, having panic attacks over how to do the magic. Because it has to feel real. And so what I finally decided was, I was writing the book and I just kept putting blanks whenever they did magic, being like, oh, I'll come up with something, and also because, I have this heavy shadow of the queen, like, ruling over me because she had 7 books to sort of elaborate school magic and Harry Potter, and I had to come up with something very, very different for the School for Good and Evil. And what I realized is magic has to come from a place of emotion, meaning like you have to want to do magic, and so it has to come from a deep need. It can't be something that you just summon whenever you sort of cerebrally want it. And so what I came up in the School for Good and Evil is that when you have enough fear or hope or anger or an emotion to do magic, your fingertip glows a unique color. So every kid, has a unique color to themselves. And only when you summon enough emotion for magic can you actually do a spell. So there's 2 parts to it. It's A, you have to actually have the need to do it. So magic comes from emotion. And B, you have to learn the sort of variance of spells and the complexity of spells in school. So I just thought magic coming from emotion to me felt like something I could hold on to and something that didn't have to be so esoteric, I think.
A couple of different kinds of magic in my book. There's magic, there's wizardry, which is really, it's when you enslave a spirit or a demon, get them to do your will. And you have to, the spell is basically like a contract. It covers, all the contingencies. Okay, you're gonna be invisible. Well, how long are you gonna be invisible? Can anyone see you? Can you see yourself? Are your clothes going to be invisible? All those things that you really have to think about when you're, transforming, becoming invisible. The other kind of magic is real magic, which is, I think, it's my favorite. It's a little more powerful. It's about connecting to the world around you and really observing it and relating to it and sort of drawing power from it and then using that in turn to influence the world. I think they're different, I think the lesson there is just that there are different kinds of magic for different books. And you have to find something that just kind of works for you, that has some, validity and resonance in the world.
I mean, my true and honest answer to that is it isn't a system. I'm a gamer, but books are not video games. And I've always had, I've never really wanted to make magic in any of my books, and I've written many books for adults as well, into something that is as quantifiable as a system. It's not science. That's the whole point of it being magic, that it's not science. And if it were science, it's still the systematicness of it. I mean, almost all of us have a smartphone in this room. I would say that not very many of us could build a smartphone on our own and understand how it works. But to me, having magic in a book doesn't necessarily mean that you have a chart where there's an equal and opposite effect of everything you do. It has to be something that makes sense to that reptile backbrain that reacts to fairy tales without even knowing why it's reacting. And to me, that isn't a system thing. There's not magic points to store up and spend out. I'm not saying that there haven't been books written where that's a really interesting thing, but for my books and the way that I write, to systematize magic would be to make it not magic.
I've always been a fan of, I like magic to have a cost. And I think a great magic system is something like what you were just describing in your book, where, you know, it's not just something that you can summon or will and just be like, bam, there it is. It has to take something. It has to, you know, it requires you to sacrifice a little bit of yourself, or to drain a little bit of the magic out of the world and leave the world a less magical place. I think it needs to, for a great magic system, it has to feel like there's a reason why only a few people are willing to work magic, and that you're willing to sacrifice something in order to do it, whether for good or for ill. And I think that's the fundamental of a really strong magic system.
We have 5 minutes for a couple more questions, and we're going to stand up.
I thought it was interesting that you mentioned Disney movies, because The Little Mermaid, everyone's original fairy tale was four, and I just thought it was so tragic and beautiful when it stayed with me, and the movie just completely ruined, in my opinion, the whole meaning that she gets the prince in the end. I don't know if you ever read the original fairy tale, but she kills herself in the end of the book. And then the story, she comes off the ship and chooses to end her own life instead of killing the prince. Because in order to become a mermaid, you have to kill the prince. So, what is your take on Disney? Like, what is your take on Disney movies and then taking these kind of morals and ideas and turning them into proper, like able for people to see?
It's a great question. I grew up without cable, so we just had VCRs, and my parents decided that they were going to raise me on Disney movies. So all I had was a VHS system and every Disney movie ever made, and that's all I saw until I was maybe 12, when we finally got cable. So I went to school, and you know, I had started reading the original fairy tales and saw exactly what you did. And the foremost fairy tale scholar in the world is this woman named Maria Tatar, who teaches at Harvard. And I just sort of went to her and was like, I want to major in fairy tales because my entire life was built on a lie. And I just want to understand what these things are, you know, because my entire consciousness is built from Disney. And so I spent 4 years really studying fairy tales. I wrote my thesis on it. You know, I became really good friends with Gregory Maguire, who wrote Wicked. And just sort of exploring the original tales only. And when I came to write this, you know, my sort of motivating force in this is that I wanted to give kids the feeling of the original stories. You know, like I wanted it to have the same horror and the sort of, you know, sort of carnal undertones of the original fairy tales, but also acknowledge the fact that we've all been brainwashed by Disney. So when they start this, they go to school, you know, the School for Good is essentially a school of Disney princes and princesses, you know, who have won everything for the last 200 years. So the School for Good wins everything. They get to school and like those kids are arrogant, they're gorgeous, they think they're all perfect, they think that evil is kind of slightly pathetic and ugly. And so they have that sort of Disney consciousness. And by the end of the book, it's that desire to break that down and make them more like the original fairy tales. So I always thought of this book as starting with Disney and getting back to what they really were. And so it's a slow deconstruction, and that's going to continue to happen over the 3 books. First book's about deconstructing good and evil. Second book's about deconstructing boy and girl, which is going to get me in a lot of trouble. And the third book's about deconstructing young and old. So it's about taking those Disney binaries and breaking them down. And the movie's going to do the same thing, which is why we're all excited about it.
And also you should read my book because I don't usually do that, but in this case I think it applies. Basically, as I was writing September Girls, it's pretty much me pitting the Disney movie and the fairy tale against each other in a sort of battle to see where it would go. I mean, it's combining both elements of those things, and I think that you know, when we look at the Disney movie and we look at the fairy tale, we have to remember that they're both drawing from the same pool. They're both sort of confronting the same issues, even if it's in totally different ways that maybe like carry a different meaning with them. And I love that conflict. I think that's like what's so cool about fairy tales.
Here's the thing. I think the Disney movie is so much worse than the original fairy tale. It tells you that if you give up your voice, if you mutilate your body, then this man who is nothing to you will suddenly love you. I think it's a horror story extraordinaire. There's no end to it. There's no such thing as a happy ending. There's only where you stop the story. And that marriage is not going to go well, I promise you. I genuinely think that if you look close at Disney, you won't see anything as pretty as they'd like you to see. And that ending scares me far more than a dead mermaid does.
And yet, I still think, you know, you mentioned one of the bigger crimes, but I think the biggest crime they ever committed was against the Hunchback of Notre Dame. And what 8-year-old kid didn't then go run out to read Victor Hugo, cry themselves to sleep? Why did he bury himself with her? I don't know. But I think as much as, you know, as much as like this crowd is bothered by that kind of stuff, mainstream audiences, they don't connect with those, you know, original endings to those kind of tales. And the ending to The Little Mermaid is the one that keeps people, it's why that movie's still relevant, why little girls still grow up watching that movie over and over and over again, and why little boys grow up watching it. I mean, we connect to it, and we kind of want that happy ending regardless of how awful the message really is. So.
I don't want not to be a defender of Disney, but I think it's far from being the only perpetrator in this. I think fairy tales have been rewritten since the time the Grimm brothers started writing them down. I mean, if you look at the original ending of Cinderella, where I think one of the sisters actually cuts off her toes with a knife to fit it into the glass slipper, and then the evil stepmother has to put on red hot slippers and dance till she dies. I mean, this is not the sort of stuff that makes it into children's books, let alone Disney movies.
That's mine.
I'm gonna have to call a timeout, and you guys can continue your questions at table 21, where all of these lovely authors will be signing and autographing and talking fairy tales.